The Rebbe started The Rebbe started off by saying that it's the Shabbos before the Shabbos of Matan Torah, during the week of Matan Torah. So in other words, just like every Shabbos you say that from Shabbos is Minei Mizborch and Kuli Yemen, that all the days of the week gets its blessing from Shabbos. So the same way, obviously, Matan Torah also gets its blessing from Shabbos. The connection between Shabbos and Matan Torah is even more than normally that we say that every week, the entire week gets its blessing from Shabbos, because we find that L'Kuli Alma b'Shabbos Nitna Torah. In other words, there's a machlekes what day of the month was actually Matan Torah, whether it was on the 6th day of Sivan or it was on the 7th day of Sivan. But in any case, regardless of what day of the month it was, everyone agrees that it happened on Shabbos. And that is because the clear connection between the concept of Shabbos and the idea of Torah. So obviously, if Shabbos blesses all the days of the week, regardless of what kind of week it is, and what kind of days there are during the week, certainly when one of those days is the day that the Torah was given, which is clearly connected to Shabbos, so certainly that there is a special blessing from the Shabbos before Matan Torah to Matan Torah. Here we find that Matan Torah takes place 7 days after this Shabbos, because the first day of Shavuos is Friday next week, so including today, the Shabbos, so it comes out to be 7 days, which 7 days is a mispar sholim, is considered a whole number. And that is so again, there's a special blessing between this Shabbos and Matan Torah. And this connection of Shabbos and Matan Torah is also brought out by the idea that we find that in Pirkei Avos, actually in Mishnayos, there are only 5 perakim. The Mishnah of Mishnayos of Pirkei Avos, there are only 5 perakim. The 6th Perek that we know as the 6th Perek, the Perek that we say this Shabbos, is not actually a Mishnah, but it's really a Brisa. Brisa, the literal translation of the word Brisa means outside, which means that it's outside the Mishnah. It's not part of the Mishnayos itself. And although the Mishnah starts with Shanu Chachomim B'Loshen HaMishnah, which means that the Brisa was said in the Loshen of a Mishnah, but that is not something particular to this Brisa. If anyone takes a look at any Brisas, which are located in the Tosefta of all the Masechtas, every Masechta has a Tosefta. A Tosefta means in addition to the Masechta, which are the Brisas, which are connected to this Masechta. So in every Masechta, the Brisas were written B'Loshen HaMishnah. And the same people that are quoted in the Mishnah are also quoted in the Brisas. And therefore, obviously, the Brisa is also in the same Loshen of the Mishnah. So the fact that this Brisa was Shanu Chacham B'Loshen HaMishnah is not something which is particular, which is special about this Brisa. It's just that in this Brisa it says it out clearly. But in reality, every Brisa is B'Loshen HaMishnah. Nevertheless, they added this Brisa to Pirkei Avos. So the Rebbe said that Yesh Leimer, it's possible that the reason why it was added was because that this, in order to be able to have that this Shabbos before Matan Torah, you should be able to say this part of this Brisa, which should become part of Pirkei Avos, and as a hachana, as a preparation to Matan Torah, you learn this Brisa, which is specially called the Brisa called Kinyan Torah. This the Perek Shishi of Pirkei Avos deals with the milas of Torah, and it goes at length the milah of Torah and how a person is Kena Torah and all the other things that you accomplish through learning Torah, which amongst the things that are mentioned in The Brisa is that Halema Teda Lishma, someone that learns Teda Lishma, is Zeicha L'Dvarim Harbi. He's Zeicha to many things. And the Mishnah also enumerates many of the things that a person is Zeicha through Limud HaTeira. Which the Tachlis of Limud HaTeira is, in other words, the highest level of Limud HaTeira was the Limud HaTeira of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that was what Moshe Rabbeinu was Moshe Kibel Teira Misinai, and he received the entire Teira. And Moshe Rabbeinu not only received the entire Teira, but Misara li Yeshua. He gave over the Teira to Yeshua. And the Rebbe explained that in the concept of Limud HaTeira, and the way a person gives over Teira, there are many levels. And as the Rebbe started off, that the first Melamed of Teira, the first one that taught Teira, was the Eibishter. He was the first teacher of Teira. And he taught the Teira to Moshe Rabbeinu. And he taught the Teira to all the Jews. He gave the Teira. Now when a teacher gives something to a student, there could be many levels. There could be a level that he's not really giving all of him. In other words, there's the Teira the way he understands it, and then there's the Teira the way he gives it over to the student, which is a much lower level in himself that he's actually transmitting to the student. By the Eibishter we find that the first word of Aseres HaDibris is the word Anechi. And the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that the word Anechi is an acronym for Ano Nafshi Ksavis Yehovis, which means that the Eibishter wrote his nefesh into Teira. Ano Nafshi Ksavis Yehovis, that the Eibishter actually wrote his nefesh into Teira. And this nefesh of him, so to speak, Kaviyochel, the Eibishter gave away to the Jews. He gave away to the Yidden. So which means that he gave the Talmud not only a external part of himself, an Inye Chitzeni, but rather he gave the Talmud the Pnimius of him. And not only he gave it to the Talmud, but he put it down even into Keach HaMaisa. And the same idea when you say that Moshe Rabbeinu was Misara li Yeshua, Moshe gave over the Teira to Yeshua. In reality, Moshe Rabbeinu had many Talmidim. All the Jews were his Talmidim. Moshe learned with all the Jews. And in fact, even in the levels of the people that were on higher levels, those that received from Moshe, we find that the Rambam in the Hagdama to Sefer Haram, to Sefer Mishnah Teira, Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam mentions all the Mekabli HaTeira, the ones that passed on the Teira from one generation to the other. So it mentions, besides Yeshua, it says Yeshua, Ubeis Dinei, it mentions Pinchas, it mentions others, people that were great people that received the Teira from Moshe. Nevertheless, we find that what does it say in the Mishnah? It says that Moshe Kibel Teira Misinai, and he gave it over to Yeshua. So the Rebbe explained that in Moshe and Yeshua there are two levels. There's the level of Stamazeh, a person learns Teira, and then we find Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't just he learned Teira. Moshe Rabbeinu, we find, was both a Nasi and he was a Melech, which means we see in the Seder Hadeiros, the way it's mentioned in Pirkei Avos, first there is Moshe Kibel Teira Misinai, Misar Yeshua, Vishua Liskenim. There were different people that were Makabel the Teira. And then it started the Zugis, the peers that received the Teira. And the peers, one of them was the Nasi, and the other one was the Av Bezdin. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, was both the Nasi of the Yidden, and he was also the Av Bezdin of the Yidden. Which means, in the Pashta sense, it means Moshe Rabbeinu not only dealt with the Ruchnius of Jews, Not only he took care of the ruchnius of the Jews, he taught them Torah and he gave them guidance on how to conduct themselves, but rather that Moshe Rabbeinu also dealt with the Gashmis of the Jews. The man that fell the 40 years in Midbar was Beschusi Shel Moshe. And later on we find that the Be'er was Beschus of Miriam and the Anani HaKavod was Beschusi Shel Aaron. But when Aaron passed away and Miriam passed away, so they all returned Beschusi Shel Moshe, because in reality, although they were coming through the Schus of Aaron, but ultimately they were coming from the Schus of Moshe. And everything that the Jews had, they only received through Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's what we find when the Yidden asked Moshe Rabbeinu for basar, for meat. So the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu, said he can't give meat. And Chassidus explains that he was in such a level that he can't bring himself down, that his ashpor should come down into meat. So to come down into this type of a food. So the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu to take Shivim Skenim, and they should be mashpia meat to the Jews. But it wasn't that they were mashpia on their own, but rather, as the pasuk says, "V'atzalti min haruach asher olecha," and he'll bring it to them. In other words, that it came from Ruchei Shel Moshe. It came to them, and through them it descended to a lower darga, to a lower level, and through that the Eden were able to get the hashpah. But ultimately, where did the hashpah come from? The hashpah came from Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, this concept of Moshe Rabbeinu, of being the mashpia, the total mashpia of Yidden, and giving the entire Torah, this Moshe Rabbeinu gave to Yeshua. And that was the specialty of Yeshua. U'misarali Yeshua, that Yeshua also received this idea of Moshe Rabbeinu. That both the Gashmis and the Ruchnius of Yidden depended on Yeshua. And the Rebbe continued and he said, what is the hero? The hero is that in every Jew there is part of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the Gemara says, the Pasuk says, Mo havaya lekecha sheil mimach, kiyum liyira. The Eibishter asks the Yidden, what is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the Yidden? And he tells the Yidden, what is the Eibishter asking from you already? The only thing the Eibishter is asking from you is that you should have fear for the Eibishter, you should have yira. So the Gemara asks, Otu yira milsa zutrasehi? Is then yira something so small, so minimal, that you're saying is this is all what he asks? So the Gemara answers yeah. Legabi Meisha milsa zutrasehi. As far as Meisha is concerned, it's considered something that's very small. So the Alter Rebbe asks in Tanya, fine. As far as Moshe Rabbeinu, it's something very small. But since we're speaking to all the Jews, so how could you say that because to Moshe Rabbeinu it's so small, it's so minimal, so therefore all the Jews we say, Mo havaya lekecha sheil mimach? So the Alter Rebbe explains, because every Jew has in himself a nitzutz, a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu, is part of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. And because of this spark of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, for every Jew is capable of awakening this spark, and therefore thereby having this yira. So in the same idea, every Jew is capable of having this idea of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a kibul teira misinai, u'misara liya Yeshua. And learning Torah and teaching Torah, not only to learn Torah the way Moshe Rabbeinu wanted a Jew should learn Torah, but also teaching Torah. And the Rebbe emphasized that when a Malamed teaches Torah or a Yeshiva teaches Torah, it is not only he's teaching Torah, but he's giving all of himself to the student, that the student should actually get all of him. And that's what's meant also with the Maimah Chazal. It says that Moshe was Pnei Chama, and Yeshua was Pnei Levana. That Moshe Rabbeinu was like the face of the sun, and Yeshua is like the face of the Levana. So So the truth of the matter is that Chama, the sun, is referred to by different names. The word Chama is referring to the lowest level of the sun. So it's trying to bring out that Moshe Rabbeinu, as a mashpia, as a Chama, gave everything over to Yeshua. Yeshua was a Levana. He received from Moshe Rabbeinu, and he received everything of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the Levana, everything. There was a reflection of Moshe Rabbeinu in Yeshua, which is again connected to the concept of Kinyan Teda, of a Jew acquiring Teda, which is an introduction to Matan Teda. The Rebbe continued and he said that although Matan Teda was something that came from the Eibishter himself, the Eibishter, as it says, that Vahani HaMaschal, I was the one that began. In other words, the concept of Matan Teda was that there was the boundary between Elyenim and Tachtenim, the higher worlds and the lower worlds, was broken. Now it could be broken in one of two ways: either that the higher worlds come down to the lower worlds, or the lower worlds ascend to the higher worlds. So what happened actually was both. That Vayered Havai al Har Sinai, the Eibishter descended to Har Sinai, and Moshe Rabbeinu vel Moshe Amar Halei Elu Elikim. But Va'ani HaMaschal, the Eibishter was the one that began. But although the Eibishter was the one that began, but nevertheless, there had to be a hachana, a preparation on the Jews' part. And what was the preparation? The preparation was that the Jews had to say, Nasa Kedem L'Nishma. And what is the idea of Nasa Kedem L'Nishma? The concept of Kabbalah Seil. The concept of a Jew accepting the yoke of the Eibishter. Nishma is the concept of understanding, of a person doing something because he understands. Nasa is a person doing something because he's listening. He's being obedient. That's the idea of Nasa. When you talk in Teda itself, there could also be two things. Is the part of Teda which is understanding Teda. Understanding, and that's called Pilpula Deiraisa, the Pilpul of Teda, understanding Teda, which is really the part of Teda which is very pleasurable. Person learns and he understands. Then there's the part of Teda which is like a dry halacha. The dry halachas is considered the Nasa part of Teda. In other words, generally, when you divide Nasa and Nishma, Nasa is referring to Maisa HaMitzvahs, and Nishma is referring to Limud HaTeira. But in Limud HaTeira itself, there are also two levels. There's the part of Limud HaTeira where you're learning Teira and understanding Teira, and comparing and analyzing different parts of Teira. And then there's the part of Teira which is dealing with the dry halacha, telling you what to do. Now obviously it's more enjoyable to understand the Teira rather than to learning the dry halachas. But on the other hand, before a person goes ahead and tries to understand Teira, first he has to know is Hamaisa Sheyasum, what he has to do. And that is the idea of the Kabbalah Seil, of the Nasa Kedem L'Nishma, which is a preparation for Matan Teira. And then the Rebbe continued and said there was even a preparation that was even earlier than that. That came on the first day, Rish Chedesh Sivan, the day that Yidden came to Har Sinai, when it was Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahor, that Jews came next to Har Sinai. And the Gemara says that it was Ki Ish Echad B'Leiv Echad. Rashi brings down, it was Ki Ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, that the Jews were united, and because they were united, therefore the Eibishter said that now they are ready to receive the Torah. So the Rebbe said that right now we're already Shabbos afternoon. Shabbos afternoon is already connected to the day afterwards. Because we see that the reason why we don't say Tzedkos Tzedek, Shabbos afternoon, Erev Rish Chedesh, is because the Rish Chodesh has an effect on the day prior to Rish Chodesh, when it comes in the afternoon, by Mincha. So now is the time to start making a preparation for Matan Torah. A person has to prepare for Matan Torah. And the first thing a person has to do to prepare for Matan Torah, the Rabbi said, was the concept of Limud HaTorah. Adding to your Limud HaTorah both bekamus, as far as quantity is concerned, ube'echus, and quality, wise, learning Torah with more depth and getting more involved in Torah. And also, again, as the Rebbe mentioned, the teaching of Torah. And also, and especially, on Rish Chodesh Sivan, which was the day that the Jews came to Har Sinai, and it was Ki ish echad b'lei v'echad, that was when the idea of unity was, by Jews, was first accomplished. So again, the idea of Avos Yisrael has to be emphasized as a hachana to Matan Torah. And again, in learning Torah itself, as a preparation to Matan Torah, the Rebbe emphasized learning the halachas of Torah. Which the halachas of Torah is the concept of the nasa of Torah, which is even kedem l'nishma. And the Rebbe mentioned that when you're talking about halachas of Torah, that also includes the limud of Rambam. Because when you learn Rambam, there are different svarim. See, the Rambam wrote different svarim. One of the svarim the Rambam wrote was Pirush HaMishnayos Lahar Rambam or Meir Nevuchim. That is where the Rambam explains different taimei halachas, the reasons for different halachas. And then there's the Sefer, which we refer to as Yada Chazaka Mishnah Torah, which the Rambam wrote as being merely the halachas itself. And over there he included all the halachas. So when you're talking about a preparation for Matan Torah as being Nasa Kedem L'Nishma, it's especially appropriate, the idea of Limud HaRambam, which is the Limud of halachas HaTorah. And the Rebbe also, this was later on in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned that although from Rambam you can't actually know the halacha, because sometimes the halacha, the way we have to do b'lepel, is not the way it says in Rambam. And as the Beis Yosef mentions, when he wrote his Sefer, Shulchan Aruch, which incidentally the Rebbe mentioned that the Beis Yosef also wrote two svarim. There's a Pirush Beis Yosef from Rabbi Yosef Cairo that he's called Beis Yosef because of his Pirush on the Tur. There's a Pirush on Tur referred to as Beis Yosef. In that Sefer he explains the halachas and he brings down different dayas and he gets involved in every halacha. But besides that, he wrote another Sefer, which he didn't get involved in the reasons for the halachas and the various different opinions, but rather he brought down halacha l'maisa, and that halacha l'maisa was referred to as Shulchan Aruch, which is again, there's the Nishma of Torah, and then there is the Naisa of Torah. The Rebbe started off the second Sikha by saying that he spoke many times about the idea of learning Rambam 3 prakim a day. And this idea of learning 3 prakim a day is in order to finish Rambam every year. Because the Rambam mentions in his Hakdama that he referred to his Sefer as Mishnah Torah, which Mishnah Torah means it's going over the entire Torah. So just like B'negei Torah Shebiksav, the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rambam brings down that there are 2 minhagim on how to learn the Torah. There was one minhag that finished the Torah once every 3.5 years. But the minhag that was widespread was the minhag to finish the Torah every year. So the same way you could understand that Mishnah Torah, which is basically similar to the concept of Torah Shebiksav, because it includes the entire Torah, is also appropriate to learn it every year. And the way to learn it every year is by learning 3 prakim a day. And the Rebbe continued and he said that we know that when something is a minig, something becomes a minig Yisrael and becomes even more than a minig, so it gets in it a teikif, a strength of a halacha. Because we have a klal, minig Yisrael teiru. And not only a halacha, but as the Rambam mentioned, that certain minhagim, the more it becomes widespread, it gets the strength of a mitzvah's essa and a mitzvah's leisasa. So again, the Rebbe emphasized the importance of learning Rambam. The Rebbe started, and he's saying that in today's shiurim of Limud HaRambam, we're learning the halachas of Tmidim u'Musafim, the halachas of Korbanos. So it mentions over there that there were various different things that had to be done in the Beis HaMikdash, different Avedas. So to decide which Kain would do each particular Aveda, there used to be a gadol, a pious it's called. A pious, they used to make a certain lotto. All the Kainim would stand together, and they would pick a certain number, and they would start counting the Kainim, and the number that it stopped by, that was the person that was Zeich in the first Aveda, and the person next to him was Zeich in the second, etc., etc. This idea, why they have to make originally, the way it was that the certain Avedas they used to run to. And when they used to run to the Mizbeach, it happened that one of the Kainim got hurt. So because he got hurt, they decided that instead of them running to it, they'd rather have a gadol, and this gadol would decide who would do it. So in order to avoid anyone getting hurt, because the Rebbe just incidentally mentioned again, that normally we say Kainim Zrizim, that Kainim was Zrizim, and they were very involved, because a Talmud Chacham, the halacha is that a Talmud Chacham is not supposed to run. A Talmud Chacham is supposed to go ukiv b'tzad gudel, which means that his toe should be on the side of his heel. When he walks, he shouldn't take wide steps, he should take very small steps. And that's a very bakavadik way of walking. That Kehanim that were very involved, they were emotionally involved in the Aveda of the Beis HaMikdash, so that not only they didn't walk ukev v'sad gudel, but rather they ran to the Aveda. And when they ran to the Aveda, some of them got hurt, but it happened an incident that someone got hurt. So therefore, they decided to make up pious. So the Rebbe was made a shaila. Obviously, the reason for the pious was because sometimes Kainim got hurt. Originally, a pious wasn't something that had to be done. It could have been without a pious. In other words, the Aveda doesn't have to be done with a pious. But after the Aveda was already done with a pious, the question was whether it was instituted in such a way that it must be done with a pious. And if it's not done with a pious, there's a problem with the Aveda. The Rebbe brought up that the Shaila is even more B'negea Dictatus. That the Rambam says that the only Kain that was Makriv Dictatus was only a Kain that wasn't ever Makriv Dictatus before. In other words, in that Beis Av, if they would have Kainim that were never Makriv Dictatus, and there were some Kainim that were Makriv Dictatus, they would only make a Gedul from those that were Makriv Dictators. That were never Makriv Dictators, I'm sorry. Obviously it could have happened that there were very few that were Makriv Dictators. Because the Rambam himself mentions that it could have happened that there was no one that was never Makriv Dictators. If it could have happened that there was no one that was Makriv Dictators, obviously it could have happened that there was a situation that there were very few that were Makriv Dictators. If there were very few that were Makriv Dictators, so obviously there wasn't such a necessity for a pious. Because the problem of someone getting hurt wasn't, if there was only one person, obviously there was no point in a pious. Because you can't make a pious with one person. But if there was more than one person, a pious is a gadol, a lotto. But if there was more than one person, so the question was if it was necessary. And the Rebbe was me'eder that could be, the Rebbe wasn't machriya, he was me'eder the shaila. He wanted people should think about the shaila. But it could be that since the Chachamim instituted that the Aveda should be done with a pious, all the Avedas, even in a situation where it's not necessary at all, nevertheless, the Avedas must be done with a pious. The Rebbe concluded that in the hero, what's the hero in Avedus Hashem? It's brought down in Tshuvas HaGeinim, an interesting idea, that someone that doesn't believe in a Gedel, it's as if he doesn't believe in Aseres HaDibros. In other words, the idea of believing that when a Gedel happens, the Eibishter is the one that will decide who will win the Gedel, is something which is very deep in a person's neshama. And in fact, even more, the concept of a Gedel, we find that on Yom HaKippurim, there were Shnei Seirim, the two Seirim, and they made a Gedel on Yom HaKippurim. Because the Gedel, just to add a few words that the Rebbe didn't mention, there is a Aveda of a Jew, which is Al Pitam Vadas. A person Al Pi his Seichel decides that this is what he's supposed to do. But obviously the Aveda of a Jew, that it's Al Pitam Vadas, is something that's limited, because every person's Seichel is limited. Then there's Aveda of a Jew, that part of a Jew, which is a part of the Eibishter himself. A Jew is a Chelik Elikam Imal Mamish, and every Jew has his Yechida Shebenefesh, the part of the Jew which is connected with the Eibishter himself, and that part of the Jew there's no boundaries and there's no limitations, and it's infinite. And that level of a Jew is referred to the level of Gedel. The concept, just like a Gedel, when a person makes a lotto, it's not something that Al Pi Seichel you're figuring something out. It's something that's clearly happening Mumaila. And the same thing when we're dealing with that part of a Jew that's higher than Seichel. And that's why Yom HaKippurim, when we're dealing with a Jew going in front of the Eibishter and being Megala his Pnimius HaNefesh to the Eibishter, connecting and trying to reveal his Pnimius HaNefesh, that's when it came out Begashmis in the Beis HaMikdash that there was a Gedel. The concept of a pious, of a lotto. And the same idea we find B'negea Purim. Purim is brought down in Tikkun Isaiah that Purim is called Yom HaKippurim, that Yom Kippur is like Purim. What's the word Purim mean? It says in the Megillah that Pur Hu HaGedel, that Haman made a Gedel, and that was the idea of Purim, which is again the idea of a Jew bringing out this very inner part of him. They ever brought out, what does it mean in Avedus Ha'adam? So he said that we find a Seder in Aveda, that it's brought down in Svarim, that sometimes a person doesn't know what to do. So obviously when a person doesn't know how to conduct himself, the first thing he has to do is look in Shulchan Aruch. And in Shulchan Aruch will tell him what to do. But what happens when we're dealing with something that there's no clear halach in Shulchan Aruch telling him what to do? So there was the Seder of certain people that they used to open up a Sefer, either a Gemara or a Zayar or whatever, and it depending what they found in the Gemara. If they found in the Gemara it's talking about something good, so they knew that they should do it, what they were thinking of doing. And if the Gemara is talking about something that wasn't good, so they knew that the person shouldn't do it, which was a Seder of certain Gedei Yisro, which is also the idea of a Gedel. And the Rebbe brought down that it says, it's brought down to Svarim, that it says Shivisi Havaya L'Negdi Summit. What is Shivisi Havaya L'Negdi Summit? Shivisi Havaya L'Negdi Summit means that when a person realizes that in front of him is the Eibishter, and not Stam the Eibishter, but in the Eibishter there are different names. Sometimes the Eibishter is referred to by Shem Adni. Sometimes what Adni means, the Eibishter is the Odin on the world. So again, we're dealing with this level of the Eibishter, the way he is an Odin on the world. Sometimes the Eibishter is referred to by Shem Elikim, which is Bigematria Ateva, again, a level of the Eibishter where he has a shaykhus to the world, to nature. But Shem Havaya refers to the Eibishter the way the Eibishter is the etzem of the Eibishter. So when a person realizes that everything, Shivisi Havaya L'Negdi Summit, Havaya is against, is so to speak, within his vision, so to speak. In other words, it's clearly visible to him that everything comes from the Eibishter. So then there is Shivisi. Shivisi Miloshin, that everything is Shaveh. That everything is the same. In other words, normally a person, when he finds himself in front of people that are making fun of him, or laughing at him, or giving him different problems in Avedas Hashem, so it's more difficult for him to serve the Eibishter. But when a Jew has this Shivisi Havaya L'Negdi Summit, that the Eibishter is in front of him, so then everything is behishtabus. And as the Rebbe expressed himself today, that whenever the Eibishter calls on him, he says, Hineni, I'm here. He's always ready. And that level is connected to the level of Gedel. The level of a Jew, where everything is connected with the Eibishter. It's not only al pitam vadas. And this idea of Gedel, which the Rebbe brought out, coming from the pious of the Rambam, is connected to Purim, which is also a Gedel, and Purim is connected to Matan Torah. Because we find, what was the accomplishment of Purim? Kiemu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim. So the Gemara says, Kiemu ma shekiblu kvar. That by Matan Torah, when the Jews accepted the Torah, they accepted it, they had to accept it. The Eibishter picked up the mountain on top of them, kaf aleim har kigiyas. Masha'ekin, by Purim, the Jews accepted the Torah from their own free will. In other words, this concept of Gedel is a hagdama to Matan Torah. How is the concept of Gedel a hagdama to Matan Torah? So the Rebbe brought it out in 2 points. First of all, in the idea of Avas Yisrael, the love of a fellow Jew, the Pasuk tells us that a person is supposed to have Ava to his Chaver, v'ahavta l'reyacha kamecha. You should love your fellow Jew like yourself. What does it mean you should love him like yourself? When a person likes himself, the love of one's own self is a limitless love. There's nothing that could stop this Ava. No matter what you do, you'll still like yourself. And how much do you like yourself? You like yourself without a boundary. There's everything in the world you do for yourself. When you're dealing with someone else, l'chura, the ava to someone else is an ava that has a limitation. By nature, since he's he and I am I, so the ava must have a limitation. That is the nature of an ava to someone else. The pasuk demands of a Jew, v'ahavta l'reyacha kamecha. And even al pitera there's such a word. The Gemara says that if someone is walking in a desert, and he comes to a desert, and he only has one glass of water, and it's a question of his life or the life of his friend, so the din is chayecha kedma. Your life comes before the other person's. So in other words, al pitera, you come before the other person. So how could you have a hafta l'riyacha kamecha? So the Rebbe explained, that's only when you're talking about cheshbenis, seichel. But when you're talking about the level of Gedel, the level of a Jew, which is higher than seichel, that level of a Jew, you could come to v'ahavta l'reyacha kamecha. And when you come to v'ahavta l'reyacha kamecha mamish, and it's vayichan sham Yisrael neged ahor loshin yachid, that becomes a hagdama to be able to receive the Torah. And that reality is also the way a person could come to nase kedem l'nishma. In order for a person to have this proper Kabbalah sale, that even before he understands, in other words, this dedication to Yiddishkeit, which is higher than his understanding, and surpasses his understanding, that is coming from that level in him, which is the Bechina of Gedel. The Bechinas HaNefesh, which is the Bechina of Gedel. And that level of him is the level which makes him a Keli, to be able to receive the Torah. The Rebbe also mentioned, I don't remember right now where he mentioned it, the Rebbe spoke about the word Bamidbar. That Bamidbar is Miloshen Midaber. Midaber. Midaber is the highest level, is Daimim Tzimeach Chayu Midaber. The highest level is Midaber. The truth of the matter is, in the Midbar, not only that normally there's no Midaber over there, but there's not a Chai over there, and the Tzimeach is also very minimal. And sometimes there's no Tzimeach at all, there's only Daimim. Medaber is a person that speaks. A chai is an animal. A tzimeach is a plant. And daimim is an
innate object.
Inanimate object. So normally in a midbar there's only a daimim, but from deswegen, nevertheless, a Jew is capable of making from this daimim into a medaber, in other words, transforming the lowest level, that it should become the highest level, the level of a medaber. The Rebbe concluded again the Farbrengen by mentioning the heroes, that a person, the first hero is the idea of limud ha-teira, learning teira, learning eating limud ha-teira, both bekamus and be'echus, both in quantity and in quality. The Rebbe again mentioned the concept of Avas Yisrael, and in Limud HaTeira Gufa, the Rebbe explained that in Limud HaTeira itself, a person should also specially add in the Limud of Pnimius HaTeira, which Yafutza Ma'inisecha Chutza will bring Bias HaMashiach. And the Rebbe mentioned, this was again the beginning of the Farbrengen, when he mentioned the Shabbos, last Shabbos, the idea of Tov Shin Nun being a Shnas HaKetz, a year which is especially appropriate for Bias HaMashiach. And the Rebbe said that every year we say a Rashi Tevis for. So the Rashi Tevis of Tov Shin Nun, very simply, is Tehei Shnas Nisim, will be a year of Nisim. And the reason why it will be a year of Nisim is because even before Tov Shin Nun, in the year of Tashmit, Mashiach will already come, and therefore, when Mashiach will come, so then there will be the Gilui of Pnimius HaTeira, Yishakein Minashikas Piu, which Rashi explains on that passing in Shir Hashirim, that the Ebershter will be Megala, will reveal the inner secrets of Teira, and through the inner secrets of Teira, obviously, the whole Gashmius Ha'elam will also change, and everything will be in an Eifen Shel Ness. And that will come through the Bias of Mashiach of the year of Tashmit Yodecha, and that's why a person should be Mesif in the limud of Pnimius HaTeira, which Teyamel Chayim Zochu, those that taste. In other words, the din is that Erev Shabbos, I'm sure it was mentioned many times, that Erev Shabbos a person is supposed to taste from the macholim of Shabbos. So macholim of Shabbos refer to Shabbos, the foods of Shabbos. The foods of Shabbos refers to the foods and the Teira that we will have when Mashiach will come, which is Pnimius HaTeira. And now, before that, we have to taste that food. And tasting that food is the learning of Chassidus. And the Rebbe mentioned that in tasting there are two types of tasting. Sometimes the din is that when you taste something you don't have to make a bracha, because you're only tasting it to know what it tastes like, but you're not really having anah from it. And sometimes if you taste it and you want to have anah from it, you have to make a bracha. So the Rebbe said that the te'amel of Pnimius HaTeira has to be in such a way that you taste it, not you stamazay taste it, but you taste it and have anah from it. And anah that you need a bracha for it. And through the tasting of Pnimius HaTeira and the Yafutza Ma'inisecha Chutza, the spreading of Pnimius HaTeira, in this year, so we will be zeichet to be as HaMashiach in the year Tashmit Yodecha, and Memeilet Shnas Tov Shenun will be Tehei Shnas Nisim. A gute Woche.
How did the girl relate to Sinai?
The Gedel is connected to Purim.
Right.
And Purim was also the idea of Kabbalah Satera.
Right.
So we see that the idea of Gedel brings out the preparation for Kabbalah Satera.
Oh, you said about our gigit.
Bapalem Har Gigit.
Yeah, you're speaking about the Torah Shabbat. You don't speaking about the Torah Shabbat big stuff. Because
I don't know the name. I need
what?
Nachon. The Rebbe didn't get involved with it. The Rebbe didn't even mention Kapalem Har Gigit. Just the idea, Nachon. The Matan Torah.
Not the Matan Torah was saying now, Seven Ishma.
Before Matan Torah, but when they heard,
After Matan Torah, not before.
I don't know what he's going to do.
After Matan Torah, it was given the Torah Shabbat, no?
what do you mean after Matan Torah?